Welcome to our channel, where the stories of people from different eras and professions come to life. We are in magnificent Ephesus, right by the sea, where the great temple of Artemis reaches toward the heavens, and ships from all over the world fill the harbor. Subscribe, and after listening, be sure to share your impressions in the comments.
The operation ended in partial success. 3 girls were saved, but they failed to obtain direct proof against Count Chesterfield. Moreover, the next day it turned out that Chesterfield had filed a complaint about an armed attack by unknown bandits. The police launched an investigation, and our detective realized he himself was now under suspicion. Mary was placed in a private clinic for treatment from opium addiction. Recovery would take months, and perhaps she would never fully recover from what she had endured. But the main thing was that she was alive and free. Justice had triumphed only partially, but even such a victory was better than complete defeat. In these days, our hero finally understood that the world was arranged unfairly, and one man could not change it. But every rescued person, every exposed criminal, every restored truth made this world a little better. And that was enough to continue the fight. The consequences of the operation at the Chesterfield estate were felt for a long time after that memorable night. The 32-year-old detective was forced to temporarily close his office and move to a modest, rented room in the Lower East Side, farther from the central districts where Chesterfield's people might look for him. The police were indeed investigating the attack on the estate, but Inspector Bradley secretly warned his friend about a possible arrest. Mary slowly recovered in the private clinic of Dr. Henderson in Harlem. The treatment cost a considerable sum, $15 a month, but our detective considered it his duty. The girl could not yet coherently tell about everything she had experienced. Opium had damaged her memory, but the desire to live was gradually returning. But what a price one had to pay for justice. The reputation of the private detective was seriously damaged. No one wanted to deal with a man suspected of armed assault on an aristocrat. Clients avoided him. Money was running out. The future looked uncertain. Try to imagine these months of forced idleness. A man accustomed to constant activity, to solving mysteries and seeking truth, was forced to sit within 4 walls, read newspapers, and reflect on the vicissitudes of fate. Sometimes he had to earn money by doing translations from French, the only work that did not require recommendations and background checks. Salvation came from an unexpected quarter. In December 1889, Mr. Gibbs, the manager of the Rothschild & Sons banking house, approached him. The matter was delicate and urgent. Someone was forging the bank's notes, and the counterfeits were so high quality that even experts could barely distinguish them. "We cannot go to the police," Gibbs explained, nervously fingering his watch chain. "Any publicity would damage the bank's reputation. Clients would lose trust. Stocks would fall. We need someone who works quietly and effectively. Inspector Bradley recommended your name." It sounded like a gift of fate. The case was serious. The promised fee was generous, $100 for solving the crime. But the main thing was the opportunity to return to his beloved work and feel useful to society again. His reputation would gradually recover if he successfully completed the investigation. Studying the counterfeit notes showed the highest professionalism of the forgers. The paper was perfectly matched. The inks were indistinguishable from the originals. Even the watermarks were reproduced almost exactly. The only difference was barely noticeable irregularities in the engraving of the portrait of President Cleveland, visible only under a magnifying glass in good light. Try to understand the complexity of the task. Such high-quality counterfeit notes could only be produced by masters of the highest class with access to special equipment and materials. In New York, there were few such people, but finding the exact one among honest engravers and printers was no easy task. The first weeks of the investigation passed in visiting printing houses and engraving workshops. Our detective posed as a collector of old prints, inquired about printing techniques, and steered conversations toward the difficulties of reproducing fine details. Gradually, a circle of suspects emerged, masters capable of such work. Among them stood out Mr. Aldridge, an aging engraver working in a small workshop in the printers district. He had once worked at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and knew all the secrets of making official paper money. He had left 5 years earlier after a quarrel with his superiors and now made a living with private orders. During conversation, Aldridge behaved suspiciously, evaded questions about recent work, and grew nervous at the mention of banknotes. His workshop was equipped with everything necessary for high-quality printing, yet orders seemed few. How then did the master live if he had little work? Surveillance of Aldridge yielded interesting results. In the evenings, he often visited the Printers Tavern on Fulton Street, a place where people connected with publishing gathered. But he met there not with fellow printers, but with strange individuals. Men in expensive clothes who clearly had no connection to the printing trade. One of these visitors was identified: Samuel Croft, owner of several gambling dens in the Tenderloin, a man with a dubious reputation who had been repeatedly brought to the police for illegal money operations. The connection between the engraver and the gambling house owner looked significant. The next stage of the investigation required special caution. It was necessary to establish exactly where the counterfeit notes were being printed, how they entered circulation, and who stood behind the entire operation. Our detective enlisted the help of old acquaintances, Jack Morgan and his peeper, who assisted in watching the suspects. The breakthrough happened by chance. One of Morgan's informants saw Aldridge late in the evening carrying a large package out of the workshop and loading it into a hired carriage. Surveillance led to a warehouse in the docks, a place where one could work quietly at night without attracting the neighbors' attention. The warehouse was rented in the name of some trading company, but upon checking, it turned out the firm existed only on paper. The real tenant hid behind dummy documents, yet the rent was paid regularly, always in cash. Everything pointed to this being the underground printing shop of the counterfeiters. But how to penetrate the well-guarded premises? The warehouse was located among similar buildings, with watchmen and workers all around. During the day, there were too many witnesses. At night, it looked too suspicious. A special plan was needed. And here, Constable James Wilson came to the rescue again, agreeing to help his friend in the new case. The plan was born after long deliberation. Wilson, in police uniform, arrived at the docks with an inspection, claiming a tip about stolen goods being stored there. While he distracted the guards with conversations and document checks, our detective slipped into the target building through a window on the back wall. Inside the warehouse, he indeed discovered a real printing operation: a printing press, inks, special paper, and ready plates for making banknotes. On the tables lay freshly printed bills, hundreds of fake dollars ready for distribution. The scale of the operation was staggering, but the most important find was a notebook with addresses and sums. According to the records, the counterfeit money was supplied to gambling dens, opium parlors, brothels, places where no one looked too closely at the quality of the notes. The distribution network covered all of New York and even other cities. The liquidation of the criminal group happened swiftly. Bradley, having received the evidence, organized simultaneous arrests at all points. Aldridge was taken directly in the workshop, Croft in his gambling house, and the other participants at the addresses listed in the notebook. The warehouse was sealed, the equipment confiscated, and the case received wide coverage in the press. Newspapers wrote about the largest operation against counterfeiters in recent years and praised the police work. The private detective's name was not officially mentioned, but in narrow circles everyone knew it was his achievement. His reputation was fully restored. Clients began turning to him again, Standing in his renovated office in Greenwich Village and leafing through the morning newspapers with reports of the trial of the criminals, our 32-year-old hero felt satisfaction from a job well done. Justice had triumphed, the criminals were punished, and honest people could sleep more peacefully. It was for such moments that this dangerous and thankless profession was worth pursuing. Success in the counterfeit case opened new doors. Now, not only private individuals, but also representatives of large banks, insurance companies, and trading firms turned to him. The office in Greenwich Village expanded, another room was rented, and a clerk was hired to handle correspondence. A new safe was installed for particularly important documents. In the spring of 1891, an incident occurred that at first seemed routine. The Lloyds Bank received complaints from several clients that their accounts contained less money than they should. The amounts were small, from $5 to $20 per account, but the total damage could reach thousands. The bank asked to investigate possible fraud among the employees. Studying the bank documents revealed a strange pattern. Shortages were found only on accounts of clients who rarely checked their balances. Elderly people living in the provinces, or very wealthy ones for whom a few dollars made no difference. Someone was clearly choosing victims with the expectation that the theft would go unnoticed. The banking system of Gilded Age New York was still imperfect. Many operations were done by hand, documents copied manually. There were numerous opportunities for falsification, but for this, access to bank books was needed, meaning the criminal worked inside the system. Surveillance of the bank required a special approach. One could not simply sit in the operating hall and watch the employees. It would attract attention. The detective rented a small office in the building opposite, and from there observed the entrances and exits, noting the arrival and departure times of each worker. Try to imagine this painstaking work. Day after day, recording who arrived when, who spoke with whom, who stayed late. After the bank closed, a picture of the institution's internal life gradually emerged. Connections between people, their habits, and peculiarities became visible. The first suspicions fell on Mr. Templeton, an elderly clerk who worked with private accounts. He often stayed late, supposedly finishing work, and had access to all necessary documents. Moreover, his lifestyle had recently changed. He dressed better, visited theaters more often, and even rented a more expensive apartment. But upon closer examination, the Templeton version did not hold up. His handwriting did not match the suspicious entries. Besides, shortages occurred on days when he was ill or on vacation. Another criminal had to be sought. The real lead was found completely by chance. While reviewing bank correspondence, the detective noticed that some client letters contained corrections in ink of a different shade, as if someone had added digits or words after the letter was written. Forgery of correspondence. That was the secret. It sounded ingeniously simple. The criminal intercepted clients' letters with money transfer orders, corrected the amounts downward, and pocketed the difference. The client thought he had transferred, for example, $100, while the bank received an order for $90. $10 settled in the swindler's pocket. But who had access to the bank's mail? Letters were brought by the postman, accepted by the porter, then passed to the manager, who distributed the correspondence among the clerks according to their duties. 4 people were involved in the chain, each of whom could theoretically forge documents. Studying the handwritings ruled out the porter and the manager. Their writing style differed radically from the corrections in the letters. This left the postman and one of the clerks, a young man named Arthur Pendleton, recently hired on the recommendation of an influential relative. Pendleton looked quite respectable, neat suit, good manners, decent family. But it was precisely this that alarmed the experienced detective. Where did a recent university graduate get the money for expensive clothes and an apartment in a prestigious neighborhood? A Cambridge scholarship did not cover such expenses. Surveillance of Pendleton required caution. The young man was clearly educated and observant and might notice being followed. But interesting details of his life gradually emerged. Regular visits to expensive restaurants, purchases in the best stores, even his own horse for riding in Central Park. Decisive proof was obtained thanks to a simple ruse. Our detective arranged with the bank manager for a special check. A fake letter from a fictional client with instructions for a large transfer was delivered to the bank. The letter was marked with secret signs to track its path through the bank. The next day, the letter was found in Pendleton's desk with the figures corrected and the same secret marks. The young man was caught red-handed, but during the arrest, he behaved strangely. He did not deny guilt, but showed no remorse, as if he had been expecting to be exposed. "I knew they would catch me sooner or later," Pendleton said with surprising calm. "But I needed the money for an important matter. I wasn't spending it on entertainment. I was investing in the future." What future did the criminal have in mind? It turned out that Pendleton was not simply stealing for his own pleasure. He had invested the stolen money in a new invention, mechanical calculating machines that were supposed to revolutionize banking. The paradox? He stole from banks to make their work more honest and efficient. "In 10 years, manual bookkeeping will become obsolete," he explained. "Machines will eliminate the human factor and make falsifications and errors impossible. I wanted to become a pioneer of this revolution, but for that, I needed capital." Try to understand the complexity of this situation. The criminal turned out to be an idealist who committed thefts for a noble goal. His invention really could benefit society, but the methods of achieving the goal were completely unacceptable. Can one steal in the name of progress? The trial of Pendleton took place before a large crowd. The defense tried to present him as a misunderstood genius. Public opinion was divided. Some demanded severe punishment, others called for leniency. In the end, the young man received 3 years in prison with the right to engage in inventive activity while incarcerated. The case had an unexpected continuation. Pendleton's invention proved truly revolutionary. His calculating machines were purchased by several large banks for experimental use. The irony of fate, the criminal earned more money from prison than he could have stolen in years of fraud. This case forced our detective to reconsider many beliefs about the nature of crime. Not all lawbreakers were ordinary villains. Some were driven by ideas ahead of their time. But this did not justify breaking the law. The end does not justify the means, no matter how noble it may be. Lloyd's Bank generously rewarded the detective for exposing the fraud and offered him a permanent position as a security consultant. The offer was tempting: stable income, respect in business circles, the opportunity to influence the development of banking technologies. But our hero understood that he was made for more varied work, where every day brought new challenges and mysteries. In his 34 years, the detective felt like a master of his craft, capable of unraveling any mystery and catching any criminal. His reputation was firmly established. Clients lined up. The future seemed stable and predictable. But life was preparing new trials that would test his mastery to the limit. A summer evening in 1892 began as usual. The 34-year-old detective was reviewing morning mail in his office, sipping cooled tea. Among letters from regular clients was an envelope with no return address, sealed with black wax. Inside was a short note. "Mr. Detective, if you wish to catch big game, wait tonight at midnight by the Brooklyn Bridge. Come alone, friend." Anonymous invitations to secret meetings usually ended badly, but curiosity overcame caution. Over the years, he had accumulated many enemies, but also enough allies. Perhaps one of the informants decided to pass important information, but feared being seen in daylight. The Brooklyn Bridge at midnight looked ominous. Gas lamps barely pierced the rising fog from the East River. Rare passers-by hurried on their dark business. Our hero arrived at the meeting place with a revolver in his pocket and heightened attention to every sound and movement. The stranger appeared as if from nowhere. A lean, middle-aged man in a dark coat, his face hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He spoke quietly, with a slight accent, possibly German or Scandinavian. He offered information about the largest criminal operation, but for a certain price. Not money, but a service. A network in the city was forging works of art, paintings, sculptures, antique furniture. The fakes were so perfect that even experts could not distinguish them. The damage ran into tens of thousands of dollars. It sounded intriguing, but what service was required in return? It turned out the informant wanted the detective to help him leave the country unnoticed. He feared revenge from the people he was about to testify against. He asked to organize an escape to America. No, wait, to Europe or South America under a new name. Try to feel the dilemma. Helping a potential criminal escape justice was itself a crime. But the information could lead to exposing a major scam and saving many honest people from deception. Where is the line between good and evil in such situations? After long reflection, our detective agreed to the deal, but with conditions. First, the informant had to provide proof of his words, and only after the successful completion of the investigation would he receive help with departure. The stranger gave the address of the White Swan Art Gallery on Broadway and dissolved into the fog. The White Swan Gallery enjoyed an impeccable reputation among New York collectors. Its owner, Mr. Fitzgerald, was considered a connoisseur of art and an honest dealer. The exhibited paintings bore signatures of famous masters, Turner, Gainsborough, Reynolds. Prices were appropriate, from $100 to $1,000 per canvas. But something alarmed the experienced eye. Too many works by the same artists, too good a state of preservation for paintings that were supposed to be several decades old. And most importantly, the strange behavior of Fitzgerald himself when talking about the history of the work's origin. Studying the documents for the paintings revealed an interesting pattern. Most canvases were supposedly acquired from private collectors who were selling family collections due to financial difficulties. But upon checking, it turned out that many of these collectors either did not exist or had never owned the mentioned works. The investigation required specialized knowledge in the field of art. Our detective turned to Professor Hartwell from the National Academy of Design, an expert on 18th and 19th century painting. The professor agreed to secretly examine several paintings in the gallery under the guise of a potential buyer. The expertise produced stunning results. The paintings were indeed forgeries, but executed at a very high level. Old canvases and paints were used to imitate the materials of the corresponding era. Even the painting style was reproduced almost perfectly. Only the tiniest details, inaccuracies in the rendering of light and shadow, anachronisms in clothing details, gave away the fakes. "This is the work of a true master," said Professor Hartwell, a man who not only perfectly mastered technique, but had also deeply studied the style of every artist being imitated. Such people in America were few. The search for this master led to the bohemian quarters of Greenwich Village and Chelsea, where artists who had failed to gain recognition lived. Here, in cheap studios and attics, people whose talent had not found application in official art created their works. Some of them were quite capable of producing high-quality forgeries. The lead was found in the most unexpected place. A paint merchant on Broadway remembered a buyer who regularly ordered old pigments, ultramarine, vermilion, ochre, prepared according to ancient recipes. Expensive materials that only a very successful or very wealthy artist could afford. The buyer turned out to be Edmund Graves, a talented painter who had been expelled from the Academy 10 years earlier for plagiarism. Since then, he had lived on occasional earnings, copying paintings for private clients. He lived in a modest studio in Brooklyn, avoiding contact with former colleagues. Surveillance of Graves confirmed the suspicions. The artist worked at night by the light of kerosene lamps, carefully hiding his activities from outsiders. In the studio stood easels with unfinished paintings in the style of various masters. On the shelves were books on art history, albums of reproductions, and notes on the technical techniques of old painters. But Graves was only the executor. Who ordered the forgeries? Who ensured their sale? Who stood behind the entire operation? Surveillance of the artist led to a meeting with an intermediary, an elegant gentleman who regularly picked up finished works and brought new orders. The intermediary turned out to be a familiar face. It was Mr. Palmer, the very swindler the detective had exposed several years earlier. It turned out that after leaving prison, he had not reformed, but had simply moved on to more sophisticated methods of deception. Now he did not steal ready valuables, but created fake ones. The connection between Palmer and Fitzgerald was established through mutual acquaintances in the world of antique dealers. The gallery owner provided legal cover for the operation, while Palmer organized the production of forgeries and their placement among genuine works. Buyers received beautiful fakes at the price of originals. But how to prove the fraud in court? Expert conclusions could be challenged, documents forged, witnesses bribed. Irrefutable evidence was needed, preferably capturing the criminals in the act. A trap plan was developed together with Professor Hartware. The scholar posed as the owner of a valuable collection, wishing to sell several paintings through Fitzgerald's gallery. He offered a genuine Gainsborough canvas worth $2,000 for sale. The gallery owner's reaction revealed his plans. Instead of an honest sale, he suggested improving the deal: commission a copy of the painting, sell it as the original, and return the genuine one to the owner. Thus, the buyer would receive a fake, the gallery would get a commission, and the real painting would remain with the owner. Everyone would be happy, except the deceived buyer. The conversation was recorded using the latest invention, Edison's phonograph, hidden in the professor's portfolio. The recording quality was not perfect, but the words were clear enough to serve as evidence. Modern technology came to the aid of traditional detective art. The arrest of the criminals occurred simultaneously in several places. Fitzgerald was taken at the gallery, Palmer at his apartment, and Graves in the studio while working on another forgery. The seized paintings were sent for examination, documents to the investigation archive. The trial took place with great public and press interest. The case received wide coverage as an example of the fight against a new type of crime, fraud in the art world. The sentences were harsh. Fitzgerald received 7 years of hard labor, Palmer 5 years as a repeat offender, and Graves 3 years, considering his role as executor. This case showed how crime changes along with society. New types of fraud appear that require special knowledge and sophisticated investigation methods. A detective must be not only a good investigator, but also knowledgeable in the most diverse fields of human activity. Rain drummed on the windows of the office in Greenwich Village, and the 35-year-old detective reflected on how his life had changed over the recent years. The case with the forged works of art had ended triumphantly, but left an unpleasant aftertaste. During the surveillance of the criminals, he had twice come under fire, first in an alley near the gallery, then near Palmer's house. The bullets missed, but the memory of the whistle of death past his ear gave him no peace. His right shoulder still ached after a fall during a chase across the roofs of Brooklyn. He had to jump from a 2-story building to escape Palmer's men who had noticed the tale. He landed successfully on a pile of straw near a stable, but dislocated his shoulder badly. The doctor had warned him, at this age, bones heal more slowly and muscles recover with greater difficulty. The mirror in the washroom reflected the face of a man who had seen much. Wrinkles around the eyes, gray strands in dark hair, a scar on his left cheek, a trace from a knife wielded by a hired assassin 2 years earlier. The body still served him, but not as reliably as in his youth. Reactions had slowed, endurance had decreased, colds had become frequent guests. But the most important change had occurred in his soul. The optimism of youth had gradually given way to a sober view of the world. He had seen too much evil, too often witnessed the triumph of injustice. Count Chesterfield had never been punished. His connections proved stronger than any evidence. Mary had recovered, but the scars of what she had endured remained with her forever. Clients still came for help, but their stories no longer surprised him. Marital infidelities, petty fraud, missing inheritances, everything repeated with tiresome constancy. Human nature does not change, only the scenery and the sums change. Lies remain lies, greed remains greed, betrayal remains betrayal. Try to understand this feeling of fatigue. 20 years of fighting crime, hundreds of solved cases, many punished villains. And the world had not become better. In place of one swindler came two new ones.
In place of an exposed scheme, a more sophisticated one was invented.
A detective is like a doctor who treats symptoms but cannot cure the disease. An autumn evening in 1893 brought a letter that would change everything. Inspector Bradley wrote about his decision to retire and move to a small town in upstate New York. He suggested his friend follow his example, leave New York with its dirt and crime, settle in a quiet place, and take up something more peaceful. "We did everything we could," Bradley wrote. "We fought injustice, protected the weak, sought truth, but strength is not infinite, and enemies grow stronger. Perhaps it is time to think about ourselves, about peace and health." It sounded reasonable, but something inside resisted this logic. How could a detective abandon his work while deception still existed in the world? Who would protect those who could not protect themselves? Who would find truth for those who were being lied to? A sense of duty proved stronger than fatigue. The answer to Bradley's letter had to be postponed because of a new case. To the office came Mrs. Harrison, the widow of a wealthy textile merchant. Her late husband had bequeathed a large sum to charity, but the money had disappeared from the bank. The manager claimed that the will had been changed shortly before death, and the funds had gone to distant relatives. The story looked suspicious. Mr. Harrison had been a man of firm principles, donating to an orphanage in the Lower East Side all his life. It was hard to believe that, before death, he had suddenly decided to leave the money to relatives with whom he had not communicated for many years. Most likely, the will had been forged after his death. The investigation began with studying the documents. The new will was dated just a week before the merchant's death, when he was already lying in the hospital in serious condition. The signature looked shaky. Either the man was very weak, or someone had forged his handwriting, imitating the hand of a sick person. But the main thing was the notary who had certified the will. Mr. Wakefield had an impeccable reputation and worked in a respectable firm on Chambers Street. His signatures and seal were genuine. The document was executed according to all the rules. If it was a forgery, it had been done at the highest level. A conversation with Wakefield yielded no results. The notary remembered Mr. Harrison's visit, confirmed that he had been of sound mind and firm memory, and spoke of his desire to provide for relatives who needed help more than a rich orphanage. Everything looked quite plausible, but the experienced detective sensed a catch. Too conveniently, everything worked out for the heirs. Too timely, the new will had appeared. The breakthrough came from the hospital where the merchant had died. The chief physician recalled that, in the final days, a nephew, a young man who introduced himself as a lawyer, had visited Harrison several times. He spent hours with his uncle, conducting business conversations. After these visits, the patient became agitated and complained about pressure from relatives. The nephew was the key figure in the case. Most likely, it was he who had forced the dying man to change the will or forged the document after death. But how to prove coercion or forgery when officially everything looked legal? Studying the financial situation of the heirs revealed interesting facts. The merchant's nephew, Henry Harrison, had accumulated large debts due to unsuccessful stock speculations. Bankruptcy and debtor's prison threatened him. The inheritance of $50,000 solved all problems at once. The motive was clear, but evidence was needed. Our detective decided to use a proven tactic: pose as a potential client of Henry who wanted advice on changing a will.
Perhaps the young man would reveal his methods.
The meeting took place in Henry's office in the financial district. The merchant's nephew turned out to be a self-confident young man with impudent manners. He willingly talked about how one could help elderly relatives make the right decisions regarding inheritance. "The main thing is to convince them of the sincerity of family feelings," Henry said with a cynical smile. "Old people often change their minds at the last moment, especially when they realize they don't have long left. You just need to be there at the right time and direct their thoughts in the right direction." The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. Henry specialized in psychological pressure on dying relatives, forcing them to change wills in his favor. The method did not require direct coercion or document forgery. Everything happened within the law, but contradicted morality. But this was not enough for a court accusation.
Witnesses or recordings of conversations proving the use of illicit methods were needed.
Our detective decided on a risky operation: ask Henry to help with the will of a fictional sick relative. The plan required hiring an actor who would play the role of a dying rich man. A professional performer from the music hall agreed to help for a moderate fee. A room in a private hospital was rented, creating the appearance of a serious illness. Henry was invited for a consultation. The trap worked perfectly. Henry demonstrated his methods in all their glory, a combination of false promises, emotional blackmail, and direct threats. Everything was recorded by a hidden observer. Every word was fixed for subsequent use in court. Henry's arrest took place right in the hospital room as he tried to force the dying man to sign a forged will. The evidence was irrefutable. Denying guilt was useless. The young man confessed to the fraud and returned the money stolen from the orphanage.
But the victory was overshadowed by a sad discovery.
It turned out Henry had not acted alone. He had accomplices among notaries, doctors, and bank clerks, an entire network of people who helped deceive the dying for money. The arrest of one man did not solve the problem. This case became the last straw. Our detective understood that evil was so deeply rooted in society that it was impossible to defeat it completely. One could only fight individual manifestations, hoping that each small victory brought the world a little closer to justice. Bradley's letter remained unanswered. While there was still strength and desire to fight, one could not give up. But thoughts of retirement visited him more and more often, especially on rainy autumn evenings when fatigue pressed down with leaden weight. Spring of Taysets of 1807 brought not only the first warm days, but also the realization that the time of active detective work was coming to an end.
The 37-year-old detective more and more often noticed how young colleagues overtook him in speed of reaction and physical endurance. The new generation of detectives possessed modern methods: photography, fingerprinting, chemical analysis of evidence. Old ways of working were gradually becoming obsolete. The last major case ended not entirely successfully. A gang of counterfeiters, which he had tracked for months of painstaking work, managed to escape at the very last moment. Someone had warned them about the impending arrest. Perhaps there was a traitor among the police. Such failures had once only spurred him on, but now they caused only fatigue. The office in Greenwich Village had turned into a kind of museum of detective art. Walls were hung with photographs from crime scenes. Shelves were filled with case folders. In the corner stood a collection of evidence: forged documents, tools of crimes, material proofs. Each item told its own story of human passions and vices. Clients now came not only for investigations, but also for advice.
Young detectives asked to share experience, to tell about difficult cases, to explain the subtleties of the profession. Gradually, our hero turned from an active detective into a consultant, from a hunter of criminals into a teacher of future generations. Especially memorable was the visit of a young man named Arthur Conan Doyle, a doctor by education who was fond of literature and planned to write stories about a private detective. He asked permission to study old cases to better understand the psychology of criminals and investigation methods. "Ordinary people have no idea how complex this work is," said Doyle, leafing through the folders. "They think a detective simply finds clues and catches villains. In reality, it is a constant struggle with human stupidity, greed, and malice." It sounded fair. Over the years, our hero had understood the main thing. Most crimes are committed not because of poverty or despair, but because of unwillingness to work honestly. People are ready for deception, theft, and even murder just to avoid honest labor. There are exceptions, but they are rare. Doyle was especially interested in methods of deduction, the ability to draw conclusions about a person from the smallest details of his appearance and behavior. Our detective willingly demonstrated his skill, telling how a stain on a sleeve could reveal a profession and the wear on boots the district of residence. "Every person carries the imprint of his life," he explained. "One only needs to learn to read it." Gradually, the idea of passing on experience to the younger generation captivated him more and more. Our hero began recording his observations and conclusions, compiling something like a textbook for beginning detectives. This work fascinated him no less than investigations, but required completely different skills. The ability to clearly express thoughts and systematize knowledge. The first chapters of the future book were devoted to the basics of observation: how to shadow a suspect unnoticed, how to remember faces and voices, how to distinguish truth from lies in witness statements. Simple things at first glance, but with so many nuances in each. Try to imagine the complexity of such work. It was necessary not only to tell about his experience, but also to explain why exactly one should act this way or that in a given situation. To convey not only knowledge, but also the intuition that comes only with years of practice. A special section was devoted to ethical questions of the profession. When is it permissible to break the law for the sake of higher justice? How to behave with clients who ask for something dubious? Where is the line between seeking truth and invading private life? Questions to which there are no simple answers. Summer passed in calm work on the book. Minor cases, searching for lost cats, checking the reliability of fiancés, investigating family secrets, were performed almost automatically, without the former passion. The main forces went into literary work, which brought unexpected satisfaction. Autumn brought a letter from Inspector Bradley from upstate New York. The old friend wrote about his new life: a small house with a garden, peaceful walks along the riverbank, the absence of criminals and intrigues. It sounded tempting, especially when outside the window a New York rain was drizzling and newspapers again wrote about another murder in the Lower East Side. "Come visit," Bradley invited. "You'll see how people live who don't chase criminals. Maybe you'll like such a life. Here you can calmly finish your book. No one will distract you with urgent matters." The offer seemed reasonable. The book really required peace and concentration. In New York, there were too many distracting factors: clients, colleagues, the temptation to take on a new case. In the province, one could fully devote oneself to literary work. The decision matured gradually. By winter, it became clear that the time of active detective activity was indeed ending. Not because there was no strength or desire, but because the world was changing. New investigation methods appeared, new types of crimes, new technologies. The old generation had to give way to the young. It was decided not to close the office, but to pass it on to a young colleague, one of those who regularly came for advice. Let him use the established connections, proven methods, and rich archive of cases. It would be a worthy continuation of the tradition begun long ago by Mr. Hargrove. The last cases were completed by Christmas. Simple stories of stolen jewelry, unfaithful spouses, petty frauds.
Nothing special, ordinary work of a private detective, but they were performed with special care, as if saying goodbye to a beloved profession. On the last working day of January 1895, our detective locked the door of the office on Green Street for the last time. He handed the keys to his successor, loaded a suitcase with books and notes into a carriage heading to the station. A new chapter of life began with a journey upstate to his old friend, to the river, to peace. The sea breeze, no, the fresh river wind brought the smell of water and pine in the small garden where the 39-year-old former detective spent his morning hours over a cup of tea and fresh newspapers from New York. The cottage upstate became a real home, the first in his entire adult life where he could truly rest. No urgent correspondence, no anxious clients, no chases through foggy streets. Bradley had been right. Life away from the capital's hustle had its charms. Here time flowed measuredly according to the laws of nature, not human ambitions. Sunrises were met with walks along the riverbank. Days were spent with a book or in the garden. Evenings ended with conversations with neighbors in the local tavern. Simple joys that had once seemed an unattainable luxury. The book, The Art of Private Investigation, had been finished the previous autumn and sent to a New York publishing house. The editor wrote that the manuscript had aroused great interest. There had never been such practical guides in American literature before. Perhaps the work of his life would prove useful to future generations of detectives. Try to imagine this satisfaction. 20 years of experience, hundreds of solved cases, thousands of observations, all systematized and presented in an accessible form for study. Young people choosing the profession of private detective would be able to avoid many mistakes that their predecessor had to make.
Special pride was the chapter on human psychology. It collected observations on how different types of people behave in stressful situations, how to recognize lies, how to find an approach to reserved witnesses. Knowledge that can only be gained through personal experience was now available to a wide circle of readers. Correspondence with Arthur Conan Doyle continued regularly. The young writer sent the first stories about his detective, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Reading them was curious. Many details were taken from real practice, but presented in a romantic light. Doyle had turned ordinary detective work into a captivating adventure. People want to believe in heroes, he explained in one of his letters. They like to think that somewhere there is a man capable of unraveling any mystery and punishing any villain. Reality is too complex and contradictory for the mass reader. It sounded fair, though somewhat, for real detectives.
Their work was far less romantic than in literature, but no less important for society.
Every solved case, every punished criminal made the world a little fairer. Let the river breeze remind one of eternity and the infinity of the world. Human life is short, but everyone can contribute to the common cause, the struggle of good against evil, light against darkness, truth against lies. Our detective had made his contribution honestly and worthily. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again over the hills, seagulls would fly to the riverbank again, flowers would bloom in the garden again. Life continues, and in this continuation there is its own wisdom and beauty. The time of struggle had ended, the time of peace had come, deserved, tranquil, filled with quiet joy from the consciousness of duty fulfilled. Or so it seemed. One crisp autumn morning in 1757, a telegram arrived from New York. It was from James Wilson, now a sergeant. The message was brief and urgent. Mary has disappeared again.
Come at once. Something is wrong.
The former detective, now gray-haired and weary, felt the old fire stir for the last time. He took the train to the city he had left behind. Mary, who had visited him the previous summer with her husband and 2 children, had seemed happy and healed. What could have happened? In New York, he met not only Wilson, but also a broken Inspector Bradley, who had come from his quiet retirement. Together, they uncovered the terrible truth. Mary had never truly escaped the shadows. Count Chesterfield, using his vast influence, had tracked her down years later. The rescue had been a carefully staged illusion. The girls they saved that night were decoys. The real Mary had been moved before the raid. All the evidence, the arrests, the newspaper glory, it had all been allowed to happen to protect the larger network. Chesterfield and his circle had used the detective's own sense of justice against him, turning his greatest victory into a cruel farce.
Worse still, Lady Morland had known from the beginning. The entire case had been a test and a distraction. Mary's knowledge of the family's darkest secrets, including ties to the Count, had made her too dangerous to leave alive. The detectives' investigation had only accelerated her fate. They found her too late. A quiet grave in a potter's field on the outskirts, unmarked except for a small note left for him. "Thank you for trying. Some truths should never be found." The realization crushed him. Every triumph, every solved case, every life he thought he had saved, all of it was woven into a larger web he could never unravel. The world was not merely unjust, it was a theater where even the audience was part of the performance. He returned to the cottage one last time. That night, sitting by the river with his old revolver in hand, the man who had spent his life chasing truth finally understood its cruelest form. There was no final victory, only endless shadows. Inspector Bradley found him the next morning. The detective was gone. A quiet end by the water, the telegram from Mary's true fate still clutched in his hand. The fight for justice had claimed its most devoted servant, not with a bullet from an enemy, but with the unbearable weight of truth itself.